There are wars that are fought with guns, and then there are wars that are fought with something far more fragile: hope. In the winter of 1944, while bullets tore through Europe and bombs reduced cities to ash, another crisis was quietly destroying the American army from the inside. It wasn't a lack of weapons, it wasn't a lack of soldiers, it was silence. Millions of American troops were fighting thousands of miles away from home, in freezing trenches, shattered towns, and unfamiliar lands. They slept in mud. They marched through fear. They watched friends die. And through it all, they waited. They waited for letters. Letters from wives, from mothers, from children who were growing up without them, from sweethearts promising to wait. Because in war, a letter is not just paper. It is proof that you still matter, that you are remembered, that somewhere in the world, someone is praying for your safe return. But the letters never came. Not because families had stopped writing, but because millions of letters were lost, stacked in damp warehouses, buried under dust, scattered across Europe. 17 million pieces of hope, undelivered. Morale collapsed. Soldiers began to believe they had been forgotten, that the world had moved on without them, that no one was waiting. Commanders noticed something terrifying. Men who had survived bullets were breaking down because of silence. One officer wrote, "No mail means low morale, and low morale meant lost wars." The U.S. Army was desperate. So desperate, they turned to a group no one believed could fix the problem. They didn't send generals, they didn't send engineers, they didn't send men. They sent women. And not just women. They sent Black women. At a time when America itself was still deeply segregated, at a time when Black women were told to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay behind. The Army gave them an impossible mission and a deadline designed for failure. Process 17 million letters, under bombed conditions, in freezing warehouses, with rats, darkness, and chaos. They were given 6 months. Most people believed they would fail. Some believed they shouldn't have been sent at all. But the women of the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion did not ask to be believed. They asked for a chance. Their motto was simple: no mail, low morale. And they were about to prove that courage doesn't always carry a weapon. They arrived in Europe not to applause, but to doubt. They were greeted by ruined buildings, broken roofs, and warehouses overflowing with undelivered mail, letters piled so high they touched the ceiling. Some had been sitting there for years. There were letters addressed to soldiers who were already dead, packages meant for men who would never open them, love notes that missed birthdays, holidays, and last goodbyes. The smell of mold and decay filled the air. This was the mission, and this was the message behind it. If you fail, we expected nothing else. They were told it couldn't be done, so they did it anyway. Working 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, without rest. They created a system from nothing, tracking soldiers with the same name, units that had moved, men who had been wounded or transferred. Every letter mattered, because every letter represented a life on the edge of hope. And while they worked, bombs still fell nearby. Racism followed them even across the ocean. Segregation didn't end because of war. They faced hostility, disrespect, dismissal. But they did not slow down. They worked faster. And something extraordinary began to happen. Letters started arriving at the front lines. Soldiers opened envelopes with trembling hands. Some cried, some laughed. Some simply sat in silence, holding words that reminded them why they were fighting. Morale changed. Hope returned. The war did not end because of them, but countless soldiers survived because of what they restored. And yet, when the war ended, their story disappeared. No parade, no headlines, no recognition. For decades, America forgot the women who had quietly saved its soldiers' spirits. History remembered the generals, the weapons, the victories, but not the women who delivered hope. Until now. This is not just a story about mail. It is a story about invisible strength, about women who carried a nation's morale on their shoulders, about fighting two wars at once, one overseas and one at home. This is the story of the 6888th Battalion, the women who fixed the war without firing a single bullet. And once you hear what they endured, you will never look at courage the same way again. Before they ever touched a single letter, before they stepped inside the cold, broken warehouses of Europe, these women had already been fighting a war at home. In the early 1940s, America was divided, not by oceans, not by borders, but by race. For Black women, the promise of serving their country came with conditions: separate facilities, fewer opportunities, and constant reminders that they were considered less. Yet, when World War II erupted, something changed. The nation needed hands. The nation needed labor. The nation needed women. And Black women stepped forward. They came from cities and small towns, from farms and factories, from families who prayed for their safety, but feared the world would never treat them fairly. They volunteered anyway, not because the country treated them kindly, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. At Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, the women who would later form the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion began their training. They marched under the same sun, wore the same uniforms, learned discipline, structure, and resilience. But they did not receive the same respect. Segregation followed them everywhere. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate expectations. They were often assigned cleaning duties instead of meaningful roles, their intelligence underestimated, their strength ignored. Still, they endured. Among them were teachers, librarians, clerks, and college graduates, women whose minds were sharp, whose resolve was unbreakable. Leading them was Major Charity Adams, a woman of extraordinary composure and quiet authority. She understood something critical. If these women were ever given a real mission, they would have to be ready, not just physically, but mentally. She demanded excellence, not to prove themselves to others, but to protect each other, because mistakes, she knew, would not be forgiven easily. In 1945, the call finally came. They were being sent overseas. Europe. No one told them exactly why, just that the situation was urgent and that failure was not an option. For many, it was their first time leaving the United States, their first time crossing an ocean, their first step into a war zone. As their ship moved through the Atlantic, uncertainty filled the air. Would they be welcomed? Would they be respected? Would they be safe? The women sang to calm their nerves, prayed quietly in their bunks, wrote letters to families they didn't know when or if they would see again. When they arrived in England, reality hit them immediately. The war was not distant here. It was everywhere. Bombed buildings, darkened streets, air raid sirens, and then they were taken to the warehouses. Nothing could have prepared them. Inside were mountains of mail, letters stacked floor to ceiling, packages covered in dust and mold, bundles chewed by rats. Some envelopes were stained with water, others had addresses written over and over again, desperate attempts to be found. This was not an office. This was chaos. And this chaos had crushed every unit before them. The message from command was blunt. You have 6 months. 6 months to do what no one else had managed to do in years? The women walked through the warehouses in silence. They did not panic. They did not complain. They studied the problem. Major Adams gathered them together and said something simple, but powerful. We're going to do this right, and we're going to do it our way. They immediately got to work. They organized shifts, 3 of them, around the clock, no days off. They created index systems from scratch, tracked soldiers by serial numbers, units, and last known locations. When multiple soldiers shared the same name, they dug deeper. When units had moved, they followed the trail. Each letter was handled with care, because each letter belonged to someone waiting. The conditions were brutal. The warehouses were cold, poorly lit, infested with rodents. Some women wore gloves not for comfort, but to protect their hands from rot and disease. And yet, they worked faster than anyone expected, faster than anyone believed possible. When officers tried to interfere or question their methods, Major Adams stood her ground. At one point, she was threatened with a court-martial. Her response was calm, controlled, fearless. "Over my dead body, sir." That moment set the tone. These women would not be bullied. They would not be rushed into failure. They would succeed on their terms. And slowly, the impossible began to crack. Letters moved, stacks disappeared, packages reached the front. For the first time in years, soldiers received mail that had once been considered lost forever. The emotional impact was immediate. Men who had felt forgotten suddenly felt seen again. Hope returned to places where despair had settled in. The women of the 6888th worked not for praise, but for purpose. They understood what this mission truly was. It was not about sorting mail. It was about restoring faith. And as word spread of their success, something unexpected happened. Respect followed. Quietly, reluctantly, but undeniably. The unit that no one believed in was rewriting expectations, and they were just getting started.
The warehouses were never meant to be conquered. They were meant to overwhelm, to exhaust, to defeat. Each morning, as the women of the 6888th Battalion walked through the heavy doors, they were greeted by the same sight. Endless piles of undelivered mail, stacked like monuments to failure. Letters from 1942, packages from 1943, holiday cards that had missed 2 Christmases. Some were addressed to Private John Smith. Others simply read, "My son." Many had been crossed out, rewritten, redirected again and again, each mark a sign of desperation. No one expected these women to solve it. In fact, many quietly hoped they wouldn't, because if they failed, the blame would be easy. But the women didn't arrive with fear in their eyes. They arrived with focus. Major Charity Adams knew the first battle wasn't physical, it was psychological. If these women believed the task was impossible, then it would be. So she reframed the mission. "This isn't chaos," she told them. "This is a system waiting to be built." They began by taking control of time. 3 shifts, 8 hours each, 24 hours a day. While one group worked, another rested. While one sorted, another tracked. No breaks for doubt, no pauses for pity. The warehouse lights stayed on through the night, casting long shadows over hands that never stopped moving. The conditions were brutal. The cold seeped into their bones. Their breath fogged the air. Rats ran freely through the stacks, unafraid. Some women screamed the first time one brushed past their feet. Then they learned to ignore them. Gloves tore, fingers cracked, eyes burned from dust and mold. Still, they worked. They worked because they knew what waited on the other side of every envelope. A mother wondering if her son was alive, a wife counting days, a child learning to write "Dear Daddy." This wasn't paperwork. This was survival. Every letter sorted was a soldier reminded why he was fighting. Every package delivered was proof that someone still cared. They developed systems no one had thought to try. Index cards tracked soldiers by name, unit, and serial number. When units moved, the women followed the trail. When soldiers were wounded, transferred, or killed, records were updated. They caught mistakes others had missed. John A. Williams, John B. Williams, John C. Williams. 3 men, 3 lives, 3 destinies. And every one of them mattered. Officers who had once doubted them now stood silently at the edges of the warehouse, watching the impossible unfold. But respect did not come easily. Some male officers resented the speed at which the women worked. Others resented their leadership. One officer attempted to interfere, questioning their methods, challenging their authority. When Major Adams refused to back down, he threatened her with a court-martial. The room went silent. She stood tall, unwavering, and met his gaze. "Over my dead body," she said calmly. That was the moment everyone understood. These women were not here to be managed. They were here to succeed. The pressure intensified as word spread. The deadline loomed. 6 months. Then whispers began. You might not need 6 months. The women did not celebrate. They did not slow down. They worked harder. Day by day, the mountains of mail began to shrink. Warehouses that once seemed endless now showed empty spaces. Shelves cleared. Floors reappeared. And then something incredible happened at the front lines. Soldiers started receiving mail. Not 1 letter, not 2, stacks. Men who had prepared themselves for silence were suddenly holding pieces of home in their hands. Some laughed uncontrollably, some wept openly, some sat quietly, rereading the same words again and again. Officers reported a change almost immediately. Morale improved, discipline strengthened, hope returned. The women of the 6888th never saw these moments firsthand, but they felt them. They felt it in the urgency of their work, in the knowledge that what they were doing mattered. They weren't sorting paper, they were restoring belief. But even as success became undeniable, recognition remained distant. Their work was praised quietly, often behind closed doors. There were no headlines, no ceremonies, and yet they didn't ask for any. Their mission wasn't about being seen, it was about being effective. By the time the unit moved on to the next location, France, their reputation preceded them. Another warehouse, another mountain of forgotten mail. This time, they finished in half the expected time. What was supposed to take 6 months was completed in 3. They did it without complaint, without credit, without rest. They did it because they understood something no one else had fully grasped. Wars are not only won with weapons. They are won with morale, with connection, with reminders of why survival matters. And in the shadows of war, these women had become guardians of something fragile and powerful: hope. But the war wasn't finished yet, and neither was the resistance they faced. Because even as they proved themselves overseas, America was still struggling to see them clearly, and the hardest part of their story was still ahead. By the time the women of the 6888th Battalion arrived in France, their reputation had already traveled ahead of them. They were no longer the unit no one believed in. They were the unit that delivered results. But respect, they quickly learned, was conditional. France was free, but not healed. Cities bore the scars of occupation. Walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. Buildings stood hollow, burned, abandoned. And beneath the surface of celebration and relief, tension lingered. The women stepped off transport trucks into another unfamiliar reality.
Another warehouse, another impossible task. More undelivered mail. The conditions were no better than England, and in some ways worse. Supplies were scarce, infrastructure was damaged, and winter clung stubbornly to the air. Yet the women moved with practiced efficiency. They no longer needed time to adjust. They had systems, they had discipline, they had trust in one another. They worked faster than ever. But outside the warehouse walls, a different battle followed them everywhere. They were Black women in a segregated American army, operating in a foreign land where freedom had been violently reclaimed, yet equality was still unfinished. They were serving a country that had not yet fully accepted them. Restaurants turned them away. Clubs refused entry. Facilities were segregated by force, not policy. Even overseas, the color of their skin determined how they were treated. Some white American soldiers resented them, not for who they were, but for how well they performed. Their success challenged a narrative many were comfortable believing, that Black women were meant to support quietly, not lead, not outperform. The women felt it in the stares, in the silence, in the tension that followed them into shared spaces. And still, they worked, because their mission was larger than comfort. Letters continued to reach the front lines, and with every delivery, morale surged. Men wrote back, thanking the unknown angels who had reunited them with home. They didn't know their names, they didn't know their faces, but they felt their impact. For the women of the 688th, that was enough. Major Charity Adams understood something critical. The danger of exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional. So she insisted on dignity. The women marched with pride, wore their uniforms sharply, carried themselves with unmistakable confidence. They would not allow the world to define them by its limitations. One incident became legendary. A commanding officer attempted to assert authority over Major Adams, questioning her leadership and threatening punishment. Once again, she stood firm. "I will not accept being spoken to in that manner," she said. Her voice was steady, unshaken. It was a quiet rebellion, but a powerful one. Because leadership, she knew, was not about shouting. It was about refusing to be diminished. As the war neared its end, the pace intensified. Mail volumes surged. Units moved rapidly. Soldiers were reassigned. Chaos returned in new forms. And once again, the 688th adapted. They updated records, rebuilt systems, tracked soldiers across borders. They delivered millions of letters, each one a thread connecting the battlefield to home. When Germany finally surrendered, the streets filled with celebration. Cheers echoed through cities, flags waved, relief washed over Europe. For the women of the 688th, the war's end brought mixed emotions. Joy that the fighting was over, and uncertainty about what awaited them back home. Because while Europe was learning to rebuild, America still had lessons to learn. They returned without fanfare, no parade, no national recognition. Their unit was quietly disbanded. Many went back to lives that looked nothing like the heroism they had lived. Teachers returned to classrooms. Clerks returned to offices. Mothers returned to families. The world moved on, and their story faded into silence. For decades, history books left them out. The women who had restored hope to millions were barely remembered. But the impact of their work never disappeared, because soldiers remembered, families remembered, and the letters, those fragile pieces of paper, had already done what they were meant to do. They had carried love through war. They had kept men alive long enough to come home. And long after the warehouses were empty, the legacy of the 688th endured quietly, waiting for the world to finally listen. Because some victories are not loud. Some courage does not march in parades, and some heroes spend their lives unseen until history finally catches up. The war ended the way wars often do, with celebration. Cities filled with noise, church bells rang, strangers hugged in the streets. Victory had a sound. But for the women of the 6888th Battalion, the end of the war arrived quietly. There were no crowds waiting for them, no cameras, no medals placed gently into their hands. Their mission was complete, and just like that, so were they. The warehouses were empty now, the letters delivered, the systems dismantled. What remained was a question no one seemed eager to answer. What happens to heroes when the world no longer needs them? The women packed their belongings with the same discipline they had brought to the war. Folded uniforms, collected photographs, saved letters they themselves had received. Some felt pride. Others felt exhaustion so deep it had no name. They boarded ships back to America, not as celebrated veterans, but as quiet passengers returning to a country unchanged. America had fought fascism overseas, but segregation still stood firm at home. Their welcome they received was restrained, polite, distant. Their unit was disbanded without ceremony. No parades down Main Street, no public acknowledgement of what they had achieved. Their service was filed away. Literally. Records marked classified. Stories left untold. For many of the women, returning home felt like stepping backward in time. The uniforms came off. The authority disappeared. They returned to jobs that paid less, to neighborhoods still divided by color, to a society that did not yet know how to honor them. Some struggled with the transition. After living with purpose so clear, sorting hope, delivering connection, ordinary life felt strangely hollow. They had proven themselves under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and yet they were expected to blend back into invisibility. Many did. They raised families, built careers, lived full lives. But their war stories stayed mostly locked inside. Not because they had nothing to say, but because no one asked. Years passed. Decades. The world moved on. History books filled with names of generals and battles. Movies celebrated victories and weapons. The women of the 6888th were barely a footnote. Some passed away without ever hearing their service acknowledged publicly. But something remarkable happens with truth. It waits, quietly, patiently, and eventually it demands to be heard. In the late 20th century, historians began uncovering forgotten stories. Archivists reopened dusty files. Families spoke about mothers and grandmothers who had served somewhere in Europe. The pieces came together slowly, and when the story of the 6888th finally resurfaced, it stunned those who heard it. 17 million letters, 3 shifts, 6 months cut to 3. A unit that had done the impossible and been erased from memory. The recognition came late, painfully late, but when it arrived, it mattered. In 2019, the women of the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. For some, it was a moment of long overdue justice. For others, it came too late. Many of the women who had earned it were no longer alive to receive it themselves. Their families stood in their place. Daughters, sons, grandchildren, holding medals that represented lives of quiet courage, stories that should have been told sooner. And as the nation finally listened, a deeper truth emerged. These women didn't just deliver mail, they delivered dignity. They proved that service does not require permission, that leadership does not need recognition to be real, that courage can exist in silence. Their legacy is not just historical, It is personal. It lives in every soldier who made it home because hope reached them in time, in every family reunited because a letter arrived when it mattered most, and in every woman who has ever been told she was not enough, yet chose to serve anyway. The silence that followed the war could not erase what they had done. It only delayed the moment the world would finally understand. Because some stories don't shout, they endure. Time has a way of revealing what history tries to hide. For years, the women of the 6888th Battalion existed only in memories, shared quietly at kitchen tables, mentioned briefly at family gatherings, remembered by those who had lived it. They did not demand recognition. They did not chase applause. They carried on. But courage, when ignored long enough, leaves echoes, and those echoes eventually grow loud enough to be heard. It began with questions. Who sorted the mail during the war? How did millions of letters suddenly reach the front lines? Who built the systems no one else could? Researchers searched archives. Historians followed paper trails. Families shared photographs and stories that had never made it into textbooks. And slowly, unmistakably, the truth emerged. The story of the 6888th Battalion could no longer be denied. What stunned historians wasn't just what these women had accomplished, it was how deliberately their story had been overlooked. 17 million letters, 3 shifts a day, 6 months reduced to 3, a mission no one else had been able to complete. And yet, no headlines, no honors, no place in the national memory. When the truth finally surfaced, it carried weight. Because this wasn't just about mail, it was about how a nation chooses whom to remember. In interviews conducted decades later, surviving members of the 6888th spoke with humility, not bitterness. They spoke of friendship, of laughter in impossible conditions, of pride in a job well done. They spoke of knowing their work mattered, even when the world pretended it didn't. One woman said simply, "We knew the soldiers needed us. That was enough." That sentence captured everything. These women had never asked for monuments. They had only asked for the chance to serve. And when they were finally seen, the recognition was profound. In 2019, Congress awarded the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. The ceremony was emotional, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. Families stood in place of mothers and grandmothers who were no longer alive. They held medals heavy with meaning. Not just gold, but decades of silence, endurance, and quiet bravery. The applause that filled the room carried more than celebration. It carried apology. It carried respect. And it carried a lesson. Because the story of the 6888th is not confined to World War II, it lives on in every woman who has ever been underestimated, in every person told their work didn't matter, in every contribution dismissed because it didn't fit the image of heroism. These women proved something the world still struggles to accept. Heroism does not always wear a uniform on the battlefield. Sometimes it works gloves in a warehouse. Sometimes it works the night shift. Sometimes it sorts letters so others don't lose hope. Their legacy reshaped how history understands service, not as glory, but as responsibility, not as recognition, but as commitment. Today, their story is taught in classrooms, featured in documentaries, honored in books and films. But perhaps their greatest legacy is quieter. It's the reminder that doing what matters, even when no one is watching, is the truest form of courage. Because when the world finally caught up, it wasn't the medals that defined them. It was the impact they had already made. The soldiers who survived, the families reunited, the hope restored.
The 6888th Battalion didn't just deliver mail, they delivered a message, one that took decades to arrive. And now that it has, it cannot be returned to sender.